Good morning. Good afternoon, if you hear us from the other side of the Atlantic. Thank you very much for the presentation, Juanjo. And congratulations to all the organizers for this wonderful initiative of celebrating this conference. And thank you for the invitation. I'm going to speak of one of the protagonists together with the diamine oxidase enzyme, which is histamine. I'm going to try and carry out an overview of the current knowledge regarding histamine in the body. Histamine is the protagonist of this conference, but also is an old companion when we travel throughout the research, because as a research group in bioactive amines and polyamines in foods, we have been working for more than 30 years now in this topic. I hereby summarize the different research findings of our group. Histamine was also the protagonist of my PhD thesis, and this is an interesting fact as well, some time ago. Histamine, as we know, is a molecule, an endogenous molecule with important physiological functions. It is not a molecule that has been found a couple of days ago. We have known about this molecule for long, since 1907, and the allergic reactions since 1932. So it is not a strange molecule, but rather one that has important physiological functions. At various elements of the body and tissues, it mediates hypersensitivity and allergies, is the regulator of secretions of the stomach, etc. It is also a substance that can be found in a wide range of foods. This is something that we didn't know so well earlier. It can be found in high quantities in certain varieties of fish and also in fermented products such as cheeses, fermented meat products, etc. In the beginning, we thought that the presence in food was inevitable, that in certain quantities, for instance, was an inevitable consequence of fermentation processes. This was the first view that we had. We later have seen that it was not always the case and that we can avoid the presence of histamine in some foods. Histamine in foods is not on its own. It generally comes accompanied by other amines. In this particular image, you can see the representation of those amines that are the regular companions: tyramine, beta-phenylethylamine, methylamine, tryptamine, etc. And others with uglier names, which do not mean that they are more dangerous or more toxic: cadaverine, potrescine. This later one mentions the material in which it was discovered. It's biaminopentane and diamine betaine. So all these amines, we have to take into consideration and remember that they are formed in foods and also in our body because of an enzyme reaction that decarbolyzes the COH group of the amino acid, and it becomes the corresponding amine. This decarboxylase reaction is enzymatic, and it is not producing histamine in any other amine due to the technology or culinary treatment. Freezing, sterilizing, pasteurizing, none of these treatments creates amines of this kind. To form histamine and other amines, we necessarily need an enzymatic reaction in the foods. It is a microbial type of reaction. So to form histamine and other amines in these foods, we require the formation first of microorganisms and bacteria with amino acid carboxylase activity. And of course, we need the precursors of these amines, the amino acids that are precursors. We need a series of conditions as well, intrinsic conditions that are required. Those conditions in general that allow the development and growth of microorganisms such as pH, water activity, the composition of foods, etc. And also we need for these amines and histamines to be formed, we can see that it happens with time and temperature. For instance, we see the histamine in tuna fish, one of the fishes in which we can find quite a bit of histamine, high quantities of histamine. And we can see that at 0 degrees Celsius, there's no formation of histamine, but this increases with time, especially at higher temperatures. And here we see one of the interests that is related to histamine in the food sector, which is the role of the hygiene conditions. In the presence of it in these microorganisms is essential. If we analyze foods in which we can find amines and histamine, we said that there had to be a microorganism presence. We can find histamine and other amines in foods that, due to the special features of them, have a certain preponderance towards formation of this. This is the case of meat, fish, fresh fish or meat. We start from the basis that if it is truly fresh, there's no microorganisms. It is only when the microorganisms start to grow and decarboxylation starts, then we see the formation of these amines. In the foods where amines are found because of this reason, because of this particular case of microbiologically altered, then we have histamine and we have diamines. We also have cadaverine. The other group of fermented foods, we see that the presence of a majority element is diamines, triamines, and histamine. These three other ones. The type of microorganisms that normally bring about these amines is different, but this will be dealt with later in the presentation of my colleague, Dr. Mariló de la Torre. And finally, within the foods where we can find histamines, we want to highlight the following. Those where there's a biogenic origin. We can see that one of the elements is fermented foods. For instance, we can have elements that have derivatives of the blood. Spoiled foods are also one of the elements. And some natural origin vegetables, tomatoes, spinach, eggplant, etc. All these ones are present. Histamine can also be found in quite variety of foods. In the beginning, we thought that it was inevitable, as I said earlier, in some categories of elements. But in this image, we can see that all lines of foods can include them. This is the amount of histamine in products, in foods that have been purchased in the Spanish market. And we can see that in all categories of products, all of them, we find quite high levels of histamine. But we also see levels that are not detected. That means that are below 0.05 parts per million. This means that we need to highlight that this old belief that it is an inevitable amine, it is not true. It is not the case, because as we can see, there are foods that do not have histamine. This is a difficulty when we want to have low histamine diets, because we don't have the certainty this makes it difficult for us to define what type of food can be incorporated to this diet. And this leads to the fact that to prevent risks, maybe we should or maybe we end up having restrictive diets that are not necessarily the case. As I said, histamine and other amines have a strong relevance from the point of view of the quality of the food because of these hygienic markers that I mentioned earlier. But they're also interesting because of food safety. High quantities of histamine may bring about unwanted effects. This is the way we see it in reports of the scientific committee of the European Food Authority, and also in a document belonging to the WHO, where we see an explicit acknowledgement of the risks entailed for our health by these foods that are rich in histamine, whether they are derivatives from meat, fish that may have it in high quantities, etc. In normal conditions, histamine and other amines in food, the ones present in food, are metabolized in the first place at the bowels level, and secondly, in a plasmatic fashion by enzymes, with dioxidase and amino dioxidase, and the metabolites that are obtained are relevant in this case. And it may happen that with a high quantity of biogenic amines, we may go beyond the level of these mechanisms of defense, and these amines may be part of the blood circulation and may bring about vasoactive effects or psychoactive effects. This transfer towards the renal circulation of the blood can also be favored when amines are vehicled in alcohol. This means that tolerance to histamine is much lower when we consume alcohol. And other amines may foster the transfer of histamine to the general circulation of blood because they compete by the mechanisms of metabolization in the bowels. Certain drugs can also inhibit these enzymes at an intestinal level. And since they are located in the bowels, some diseases in particular that entail inflammation of the bowels may lead to a lower degree of enzymatic activity, degrading amines at the bowel level. When these amines are transferred to the general circulation of blood, then we may have adverse effects. Until quite recently, we only knew the intoxication by histamine. Now we know as well that there is a clinical situation in which we have histamine intolerance and not intoxication. This would explain a difference between the two different situations, which are both connected to the high level of histamine. We also want to highlight what are the metabolization pathways. One is a bowel or intestinal pathway. DAO is the main protagonist here. And then there's one that has to do with the liver, a hepatic one, which is the HNMT. Once the metabolites are formed, we see the intervention of aldehyde dehydrogenase. This is an enzyme that intervenes in the metabolization of alcohol. And here we can explain why, when histamine is vehicled with alcoholic drinks, the toxicity is higher, because we impede the metabolization because there is a competition for this enzyme. Histamine and DAO are two key enzymes for metabolization of histamine. These two enzymes act at a different level. Histamine imidazolphinase is an enzyme that metabolizes histamine in an intracellular level, but diamine oxidase metabolizes it at an extracellular level. We are in a DAO enzyme conference, so we have to speak about DAO. DAO is an enzyme that in the last few years has been extensively studied, but it was found in 1929. Histaminase was the first name that it received. Still, this enzyme is called histaminase in some scientific journals in food science, but in nutrition, clinical, medical journals, we use diamine oxidase. Why this change of name? Because we then saw that DAO, or histaminase, could not only metabolize histamine, but it could also metabolize other diamines that could be found in the body or in the food. The reaction that catalyzes DAO, as you can see in the image, is to convert amine in an aldehyde. And this is the reaction that takes place in this particular case. The adverse effects of histamine may take place when there is an imbalance, an accumulation. In low quantities or reasonable quantities of histamine, the physiological functions are essential, as we can see, but the adverse effects may take place when there is an accumulation in plasma, because there is an imbalance between the histamine that we intake and the one that we liberate through the reservoirs and the ability to be metabolized. This can take place when there is an increase in the intake. There is an endogenous release as well, which is high, or this may happen as well, and this is the new finding, when there is a low metabolization of histamine. When these three events happen is when we do have problems related with histamine and adverse effects take place. We normally have headaches in the central nervous system. Digestively, we have nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, abdominal pain. The clinical situation is different regarding allergies, but these circumstances are the same. So in the skin, we also have rashes, itching, urticaria, etc. And cardiovascularly, we also may have hypotension and tachycardia. The fact that we have so many symptoms and so specific ones is certainly a difficulty when we have to diagnose both intoxication and intolerance. Why are there so many symptoms? We can see this in this image when in the first crown, we can see the physiological effects of histamine. It acts at various levels in different tissues and organs with different factors. And in the second crown, around it, we see the symptoms that are stemming from an increase in the accumulation of histamine. If at a physiological level we have functions in the central nervous system, in bone marrow, in gastrointestinal system, in the uterus, respiratory system, the skin, cardiovascular system, etc. So it is therefore logical that when we have an increase in the levels of histamine, we have reverse or adverse effects such as vertigo, headache, circadian rhythm alterations, diarrheas, meteorism, dysmenorrhea, urticaria, itching, hypertension, etc. We not always have all the symptoms, and in fact, we have gaps in the knowledge because sometimes we have some symptoms and some others we don't have them. There is an article by by Amines and others that relate both aspects. Histamine effects according to plasma histamine concentration. And this is something that we have to go through in the analysis to clearly discern what happens, because sometimes we have symptoms and some other people we have others. And in the accumulation of histamine in plasma, we heard the allergic consequences, obviously, but it could be a pseudo-allergic, not only allergic reaction, and on IgE-mediated pseudo-allergic reaction. It may happen as well because there's an excessive intake of histamine. Then we will speak about intoxication, obviously, and also a diminished capacity or ability for the degradation of histamine in our bodies. There are scientific bodies that use this term, but we therefore speak in the last case about intolerance that may happen because of a deficiency in DAO enzyme. Histamine intoxication is a situation that is quite well known. Histamine is an old danger that we know for long. For many years now, we have seen intoxication of this kind that used to be called scombrotoxicosis or poisoning, pseudoallergic fish poisoning, etc. And they were falsely that. This happens, we can see here, when there is an extra intake in healthy individuals. These are these brown, black bubbles here that all goes over the defense mechanisms for degradation at an intestine level. These green semicircles, when there is so much intake, this goes beyond the limit, and histamine reaches the blood circulation, and then this brings some symptoms. What are the symptoms? More or less the same that we mentioned earlier. They are characterized by outbursts, just in the case of food intoxication. Normally 30 minutes after the intake, normally they don't require a specific treatment, may have spectacular symptomatology, but if they are not serious, they recede spontaneously in 24 or 48 hours. Unlike other intoxications of microbial origin, its prevalence has not diminished. Here we can see the data of outbreaks of this kind from the European Authority for Food. We can see the evolution of cases and outbreaks. We can see the low levels. In 2019, there were 96 outbreaks in 11 different EU states. It's quite a significant figure to take into consideration, obviously. And foods that are most frequently related with this histamine intoxication is mainly fish. And tuna fish in particular is very relevant. Tuna fish is quite highly related with histamine intoxication. They are quite frequent, and these are some of the situations that have been reflected in the press in Spain. In spite of this intoxication being known for many years now, there are still gaps in this regard, scientifically speaking, things that we have not solved properly yet concerning this intoxication. And there is no consensus on the amounts of histamine in foods that is responsible for the intoxication by histamine, the outbreaks. There are few dose-response studies of dietary histamine to be able to assess the dose-effect ratio in the food. we actually find a wide range of figures, 75 to 300 milligrams when administered with food. We also likewise have big differences and uncertainty regarding the levels of histamine in food associated with outbreaks, and this varies considerably. We may have values of histamine in foods between 200 and 10,000 milligrams. So it is amazing the range, the difference. So when there's such a range, obviously there are some things that we have not solved yet. These data belong to the scientific committee of the ETSA, the scientific body for assessment regarding food and nutrition. And in this table, we see studies that include the dose-response ratio that have been published, in which what we offer is the administration for voluntary individuals, a short number, up to 8 different dosages of histamine, vehicled in different foods and drinks. And what we do register is from what dosage on we see the effects. What we can see here is that the adverse effects can be found in dosages that are quite different. So that's why we have this enormous variability of ranges that actually range from 75 to 300 milligrams when histamine is being administered or vehicled with food. We also see in this recent study, in this meta-analysis that took place, and that was published in the Critical Review and Nutrition, we see the content of histamine in foods that have been responsible for the outbreaks of intoxication. So there's obviously a tremendous variability in the contents of histamine that were found in food and that were responsible for the appearance of the symptoms. This is the reality that we have to describe regarding this histamine intolerance. Normally, this high degree of variability indicates that there are things to be solved yet. There's a high degree of uncertainty in this regard, and we have to further research. In order to try and understand as much as possible the uncertainties that we are making reference to, we actually can pose 2 hypotheses that could be valid. One being that when we assess the dosage response effects and the quantities of histamine found in the foods, we only paid attention to histamine because it is the one that is in charge of the effects. But it is not histamine alone, because the presence of other amines may also increase the absorption of histamine in particular, and therefore probably determine that we have to actually establish an index for histamine that includes other amines that are responsible for the effects. And the other thing that was not analyzed yet is that we did not assess in the participants that took part in the study that there could be intra-individual differences in the ability to degrade histamine. The fostering of the effect of histamine because of other amines is one of the research lines in our group. This topic is also included in the findings of the European Authority, and the results of our research work will be published in further talks, colleagues from our research group in this particular conference that we're holding today. And the other element that I would like to highlight for this conference is the differences that are intra-individually seen in the degradation of histamine. A deficiency in DEO at the level of the intestine could be the main factor explaining the high variability in the response of individuals when administered certain dosages of histamine. And this could be one of the main elements that is responsible for the presence of this. This, of course, entails that there is a change of paradigm, a paradigm shift. Until we have acknowledged the role of these particular elements in the intestine problems, when we speak about intoxication, the blame, so to say, in inverted commas, was in the hands of foods. The fact that we may have intra-individual differences entails, as I said, a paradigm shift, because again, between inverted commas, the ones to blame would not be the foods, but it could be the case that people have different abilities to metabolize histamine and therefore may respond differently to different dosages of histamine in food. Therefore, histamine intolerance is defined as a disorder in histamine homeostasis, which is mainly due to a reduced activity of the DAO enzyme at the intestinal level. This causes, therefore, an accumulation of this anemia in plasma and the appearance of clinical symptoms. It may be called as well enteral histaminosis or sensitivity to dietary histamine. There's not a lot of information regarding this, but a research job by Amines and collaborators highlights that this could be around 1% of the population, which is quite a lot. It is a significant piece of. In order to compare this with histamine intolerance that we saw earlier, intolerance of this kind is reflected here. There doesn't have to be necessarily in the food high quantities of histamine. In this particular case, what we see is that there are enzymes that are responsible for metabolization, and this is inhibited, at least partially. And although there is not a lot of intake, the amount that ends up in plasma would bring about the symptoms that we have discussed earlier. As I said, histamine intolerance is a very well-known topic for many years now. It is gaining ground and impetus in the research we have seen in the last few years. This is only a graphic that would show you the evolution of publications regarding histamine intolerance, DAO deficit, etc., in the scientific databases, PubMed, Web of Science, etc. And we can see that the amount published is increased and enormous in the last few years. Most of it, as we can see, has been published in the 2016-2020 period. And why is that? Why do we speak about histamine intolerance? We probably have to, of course, carry out a consensus for this particular thing. We use this because there are a few landmarks that deal with this expression. Since 1999, the European Academy acknowledged, or actually underlined, that there have to be further studies to define the clinical role of intolerance to histamine, especially when we end up having symptoms such as allergies, etc., and to determine, of course, what would be the level of histamine that would bring about the symptoms. This report I have mentioned in several times by the EFSA, the European Authority. It suggests that whether it be for genetic reasons, drug reasons, or whatever, it may end up having an excess in histamine, and it calls it histamine intolerance. Reference or landmark bodies such as FAO or WHO refer to this problem as histamine intolerance as well. And they also say that we have to further deepen the knowledge. In different roundtables that we have held, that we will hold in this conference, we will speak about these particular issues concerning the deficit of DAO, or DAO deficiency. Where is the origin? This will be dealt with. It has been described it could be a genetic origin. This is obvious. Very recent data from the previous years say that. We have identified mutations that end up producing a further activity of DAO. There's also a possible origin, which is quite frequently named, and this is problems at an intestinal level. There could be a compromise of the liberation of the dioxidase symptom. This could be a problem when there is a pathology in the liberation of other enzymes that are needed for digestion, for instance, lactase, which is necessary to digest lactose. We have also identified up to 90 drugs that could temporarily inhibit diamine oxidase, provoking the symptoms that includes accumulation of histamine. This is a very spectacular topic. There are 90 drugs. This is an enormous amount. But when we analyze the bibliography in depth, there's still a lot of work to do because it is not clearly consolidated. There are studies that indicate that, but we need to further deepen on this. And finally, something that we will hear from our colleagues is that we're also working on the possible origin of this intolerance as a consequence of an intestinal problem, whether it is this dysbiosis in the intestine because there are imbalances of histamine that could end up being absorbed, or because there is dysbiosis because some microorganisms that have amino oxidase activity are present. Then this would imply an accumulation, a further accumulation of histamine. For dietary management of histamine or intolerance, there are two alternatives. One is supplements and exogenous supplements with DAO. As we can see in the review of the scientific literature, there are clinical studies in which efficiency of these diets is assessed with all the elements that are included. We have also identified in the literature 13 works, 13 articles, and in 12 of them, in 12 out of 13 studies, there's a description of the improvement in symptoms. In some studies, additionally, we can say that there is an improvement of the levels in plasma. In all the cases, we're speaking about studies that from the scientific perspective, they are very valuable. All of them point in the same direction, but we have to admit that these are studies that are carried out with not many individuals, with the M, and they not always have an adequate duration. And this is very important as well. Diets that are low in histamine do not have a consensus in what this entails. In each article, in each publication, we may have variations regarding the foods that are included in this diet that is low in histamine. Actually, one of the possible strategies related to the diet is that in the future, we can compulsorily recommend the labels, in the label of the foods, this particular aspect. It could also be a strategy for the future to produce low histamine foods. Diets may be efficient because there is no consensus on what is the diet that is low in histamine, a scientifically accepted consensus by the scientific community. There's also a lack of consensus in the levels that enable us to declare what is a low level of histamine. The values could change between 2 to 20 ppm, parts per million. So when we have these difficulties, it may be relevant to have a supplement that enables us to metabolize histamine dietetically. And this would be the DAO supplement. Scientific literature has also told us that there are 5 intervention studies using this supplement in which we wanted to assess the efficiency. And in most of them, in all of them, we have a positive effect, more or less intensity, in the reduction of symptoms. Just as it happens with the clinical studies of diet, there are also different variabilities here. Not many patients have a reduced N14 to 100, reduced time for study, for intervention. Maybe 4 weeks is not very efficient, but maybe 8 weeks is efficient. And different DAO dosages used in the different studies. And I will finish now with an example, a real case that entails the transfer of this intoxication in nursery schools. These are nursery schools in Catalonia in November, December 2006, a few years ago, where the health inspectors actually had to intervene because some children, not all, had features that were typical of allergy or typical from accumulation of histamine. These health inspectors analyzed the foods that were consumed because they quickly thought that it could be an intoxication of this kind. And they analyzed foods that could have histamine, and they saw that they had macaroni with cheese that had high levels of histamine. They thought that this would be a histamine intoxication because of the consumption of cheese in poor conditions with high quantities of histamine. Then the case reached the Catalonian Agency of Food Safety. It was reassessed, analyzing the risk analysis. So we actually calculate the amount of histamine they were exposed to. Not only the amount of histamine. In this risk analysis, we saw that the amount of histamine that had been consumed, considering the cheese consumption 20 to 30 grams, was insufficient to bring about this crisis. The fact that not all of them were affected and all of them had the macaroni, and the fact that it was in winter, and through a survey, they reached the conclusion that those who had the symptoms were not suffering from an intoxication, but rather an intolerance to histamine, in which drugs being administered to them, fluimicil or mucolytic drugs that are used in November, December to avoid the symptoms of cold, of having a cold, then they inhibited the DAO enzyme. So an example that may make us reflect upon this, and with different levels of histamine included as a responsible element for the effects. In fact, it is not only an intoxication, but rather an intolerance due to DAO deficit. So this is something that we should study in the future. And I will finally finish with the conclusions to say that intolerance to histamine due to the DAO deficit is a new disorder, which is brought about by an old danger, which is histamine. And this knowledge may help explain the uncertainties that are historically associated with the appearance of these type of outbreaks. As I have tried to summarize, and since in the sessions of the conference we will see, there are many hypotheses. It is a very interesting topic, and we have to accumulate research and science for these hypotheses to be transformed in evidences. There's a lot to do, there's a lot to research to show a clinical evidence and the relation with other intolerances. We have seen scientific studies that relate intolerance to histamine with the intolerance to lactose. So we need to further research to standardize diagnosis tools for histamine intolerance and for the DAO deficit, and of course for the clinical studies that would prove both the efficiency of the supplement for DAO and the efficiency of diet for the improvement of the symptoms. This is the final slide. These are the current lines of research of our group. We have been working for 30 years, as I said. Biogenic amines is one of the lines. These are the reasons why foods are formed and the control of food. We're trying to bring a new evidence on intolerance. This is what we're doing at the moment. We're trying to further develop in etiology, diagnosis, and dietary control. And we will speak about these evidences that we are building. And I would also like to point out that we're working on other amines that have not been quoted because they were not the topic of interest today, but they have quite an important relevance, which is polyamines. Because we call them the forgotten components because they are antioxidant elements. They are related to aging, and they are considered anti-aging substances, and they are protectors of the so-called chronic diseases or civilization diseases, diabetes, cardiovascular ones. And the last line of research that I want to mention, which is becoming very interesting as well, is that in the field of circular economy, we are trying to reuse cavalese and other byproducts of food industry as promoters of the growth of microorganisms, and we're studying the potential as prebiotics and the role of them to increase the safety of this food. And this is my image of the wonderful team that we have, and thanks to it we can further develop. Thank you very much for your attention.